up, we're going through the entire book of Matthew, and we're picking up where we left off last week at verse 14 of chapter 12. But this whole theme, this whole section of Jesus has been talking about our rest, our Sabbath rest. We talked about that, especially last week, picking up on the theme from the end of chapter 11, in which Jesus invited everybody to come to him so that he could be rest for us. And in this particular passage, he talks especially about rest for the broken reed, for the smoldering wick, for those people who are down and out, who seem like their lives never find any rest. This particular passage haunts me for a lot of different reasons, mostly because we Americans don't consider ourselves to be broken reeds and smoldering wicks. If you understand what broken reeds and smoldering wicks is, it's basically something that's worthless. I liken it to, I don't know if you've ever worked with a stapler. Surely you have. That has a brick of staples that you put in the stapler. At least give some type of response if this has any type of semblance of reality for you. And one of them breaks off. What do you do with it? You pitch it. I mean, back in my miser days, I would put the brick in and then put it first in line so it would push up with a little springy thing and I could get the one extra staple. Some of you think that's insane. I was poor. This is what Jesus is saying. He is willing to go to the extent of salvaging. Reeds were very, very cheap. You could get hundreds of them for a dime. And what Jesus is saying is, even if one's broken, which basically means you would discard it and come up with something else because you wouldn't mess with it because it was not worth it. Jesus says, no, you're all worth it. If you're a smoldering wick, that meant that the oil was running out, and I don't know if you've ever been in a room where a smoldering wick has been the case, but it fills the room with smoke and kind of is gagging to you. Jesus says, even though you should be discarded, because a smoldering wick meant that you were getting near the end, it was too short to reach the oil, and so it was just burning the cloth, the wick part, and so you just pitched it and got a new one. Jesus is saying, no, I'm even willing to go to the extent of salvaging the people that make me gag. How about you? Are we willing to go to that extent to salvage the people who appear to be worthless? Kind of keep this sermon in mind as we go into next week's message. Actually, 2 weeks. I'm going to be gone next week. In 2 weeks, boy, that's going to be hard to keep this in mind for 2 weeks, isn't it? But keep in mind how Jesus is willing to rescue even the broken reed and the smoldering wick, even as worthless as they appear, because the first miracle he's going to do after Matthew quotes this saying is going to be healing someone who's blind, mute, and demon-possessed, which is kind of in that culture and in our culture, somebody who really is worthless. This text haunts me in a lot of ways because it points to the way we should be. It's one of several suffering servant texts that Isaiah has in his scriptures, and I mentioned earlier, it's the longest quote that Matthew uses of the Old Testament. If you remember, Matthew makes a lot of quotes of the Old Testament. This is the longest, and I believe for good reason, because it probably gives the most comprehensive view of the Messiah's agenda. Listen very, very carefully as Professor Tom Treloar reads for you Matthew chapter 12, verses 15 through 21.
Please stand out of respect for the reading of God's word. Matthew 12, beginning with verse 15. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. Many followed him, and he healed all their sick, warning them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. May God bless our understanding of his holy word. Amen. You may be seated.
Great, thank you. If you'd want to pull out your sermon outline, should be in your service folder. Looks like this. I'll pull up the stand if I can. Nope, it's hooked. Obviously should have done this ahead of service. Part of the smoldering reed. Oh, yeah, smoldering wick. Good morning. I'm getting a strange sense of, is my hair okay? Okay. We haven't even got started. Let's take a look at the sermon outline, if you pull that out. The question to be answered is this: why does Matthew take time out in the midst of revealing that Jesus is our Sabbath rest to say Jesus is a fulfillment of Isaiah 42, 1 through 4? And this is a significant text that we need to look at. I believe the answer is this: because Jesus is so unlike any other leaders that his audience had ever experienced, that Matthew needs to demonstrate that this is a sacrificial servant leadership that God had said would distinguish a Messiah and those who are his disciples. Not only is this text pointing to Jesus and his willingness to suffer and to be a servant in order to bring us salvation, in order to bring justice to the nations, but he's asking us to be the same way. And that's one of the really, really hard things about this text, especially when you look at to the extent that Jesus was willing to go. The word for the day is servant. And we all like to be called servants of the Lord until we're treated like one. This last Friday, Jody had a movie night and showed Cinderella. And she was definitely a servant. The movie does a great job of setting her up to be a servant to her two wicked stepsisters and wicked stepmother. But justice prevails. There are so many messianic themes through that movie. It really is pretty cool to see how. Have you ever thought about the way movie makers adapt themes that are Christian themes or God themes that I think are innate in all of us? I'm going to speak at the fair a little bit later on and talk about how we have a desire to connect with nature, kind of fitting with the fair and the animals, that kind of stuff, and how that, I believe, is built in us, and how Isaiah 11 says it will one day be manifest to us, so much that a little child will be able to play with an asp, a little poisonous snake. Anyway, that's at the fair. You can save your service folder and come in for free if you make it before 2 o'clock. We need to all have courage and be kind and be servants to the world that may be to us smoldering wicks. May be to us the kind of personality that makes us gag. Welcome to the Hillsdale Free Methodist Church. I've warned you before that this is a dangerous place to be, because, folks, I really want to proclaim the truth of what the Word of God has to say. And this is a text that I think we need to seriously look at, because it's become very, very convenient in 21st century America for the church to be an exclusive social club. One of the things that I've been privileged to do is attend a lot of different churches in a lot of different church settings. I told you that I was involved with Huntington College then, and on a deputation team, and I went to probably 150, 200 different churches with part of that group, and then also visiting my son and my two daughters at their home churches when they were at different churches, getting a sense of how their churches operate. And I'll tell you something I would every once in a while recognize about churches: their sterility. You would walk in and everybody was dressed to the nines. Everybody was well put together. Everybody had a smile on their face. There was no crutches. There was no walkers. There was no wheelchairs. There were no casts. There were no lower class people. They had in all effect, created a culture in which those people were not accepted. And they felt very uncomfortable coming to that church. Folks, if that ever happens here, it better not. God holds a special place for the people in wheelchairs, for the people who are disabled, for the people who are aging. People who are aging. This pastor is going to have to retire one day, and I want a church to come to that will accept me, even though it takes me 40 minutes to get from here to there. There are churches who have I've seen a church of 1,500 people, not a single wheelchair, not a single crutch, not a single cane, not a single anything. I was shocked. We need to really evaluate our hearts and evaluate our spirits of what kind of a message are we conveying just by living, just by existing. Are we welcoming and inviting people who are broken into our congregations? Are we accepting people who are smoldering wicks, who are not the easiest to get along with? We'll talk more in that a little bit. Okay, number one, Jesus is the servant, Lord's servant to ensure justice is brought to the earth. Look what he says in verse 18. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him. That's crucially important. And he will proclaim justice to the nations. Justice is basically equal treatment under the law. And folks, here in America, we're losing that concept. Really, the privileged, the powerful, the influential, the people who are wealthy get a little better deal than what everybody else, thus of us lower class, get. And that should never be the case in a nation that upholds God and his justice. Folks, the minute it becomes Darwinian in our social fabric, in our social structure, we're in big trouble. Because it becomes survival of the fittest, of survival of the people who have got the money. You know what really irritates me? Is almost one out of every 4 commercials is some lawyer suing somebody else in order to get a lot of money. I'm not sure a lot of those suits are just. And we've become a nation that is fueling those ideas, fueling that mentality. Do you know you're cutting our own throats? I heard on a sermon that Tim Keller gave of a talk show. You know how talk shows love to create conflict? You have sensed that, right? How one show created this conflict and the people murdered each other outside of the show. And there was a big to-do about, we should put a stop to this. And they said, we can't put a stop to it. It makes us money. Oh, yeah, I remember a presidential campaign telling me, it's the economy, stupid. Really? Have we sold our souls to the devil? Have we sold our souls to the dollar and forfeited everything else that is just and right and moral? We are killing ourselves. We're cutting our throats. And I really get upset at the people who appear just and put on airs of being just, but secretly are doing everything that they do for their own advantage. And nothing illustrates this more than a friend of mine who was a missionary in Honduras. I talked to my wife after the first service and got my facts straight. And it's even better than the first service. You're getting the new and improved version. I had a friend of mine who was a missionary in Honduras when a hurricane went through and just devastated tens of thousands of homes. And they were in the process of rebuilding as many as 9 and 10 homes a day at the cost of $900 a home. And they had a whole crew that was doing this. When they were told that they had to cease their work on this particular weekday because a politician was coming in, and for security reasons they had to evacuate the area and allow this politician to come in, is kind of a picture, a photo session. He spent $1 million to fly from the United States to Honduras, along with 50 of the press crew, media crew, to go in, evacuate the area, him go up to the mountains of Honduras, put a shovel in the dirt, film it, and then after 3 minutes of filming, get back on the plane with his 50 media people and fly back to the United States at the cost of $1 million. All to say how concerned he was for the citizens of Honduras. Do you know how many homes $1 million would build at $900 a home? Can you do the math? It was about 1,100? Somewhere around. I looked to a math person because a lot. And they had to stop doing construction in order. Does this not irritate you? Some of you say, well, what's the big deal? I'll tell you what's the big deal. It's not right. It's unjust. It kind of reminds me of the mother who wanted to appear just before her child and had this big cookie jar. You know, the big lids on screw on land. And the daughter came and said, can I have a cookie? And unscrewed and said, here you go, honey, you can have a cookie. And the daughter said, well, don't you want a cookie? Oh, no, mothers shouldn't have cookies. Mothers only get broken cookies. And then screwed on the lid and went. It appears just, but they're really doing things in order to get what they want. Folks, looking at the scriptures, being sensitive to the Spirit of God will not allow you to do that without your conscience haunting you. And we need to be in touch with our consciences if we ever hope to be servants of the Lord. I think one of the greatest servants of the Lord in the last 50 years was Mother Teresa. I mean, the people that she spent her time helping and trying to rehabilitate were people who were exactly what Jesus is talking about here. Broken reeds and smoldering wicks. And do you know that when she spoke at Harvard several years ago, obviously because she's been dead quite a number of years, but when she spoke at Harvard, she went there and she said this, I understand that there are lots of you students in this school who are doing things that displease God. You are harming yourselves and offending God. Some of you are drinking alcohol and taking drugs. Others of you are engaged in sexual sin of many sorts. I have a message to you from God. Repent, turn away from what you are doing. Do you know how the people of Harvard University responded to Mother Teresa when she said that? They gave her a standing ovation. You know why? Because she had distinguished herself as a servant. Not interested in promoting herself, and no one could question her integrity, and were willing to listen to her. Folks, we need more people with that kind of spirit, who are doing what they do for the Lord's sake only, and not worried about personal gain or personal advantage or personal benefits. Number 2, Jesus is the Lord's servant, humbly doing God's work without self-promotion. That's what it means in verse 19. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. It's basically talking about his humility, how he's willing to just do whatever he does. In fact, several times in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells the crowd, don't tell anybody. This is one of the texts today. If you look carefully at the text, Jesus says, don't tell anybody when you go out. Why? Because Jesus was concerned that they understood who he is and not who they wanted him to be. And the people's perception of the Messiah was going to be this conquering king. And yes, he is going to be a conquering king, but that's not why he came the first time. He came to be a suffering servant. In fact, there's a lot of tension in the book of Isaiah between the conquering king and the suffering servant. And the people of Israel for 700 years, from the time Isaiah wrote it in 700 BC up until the time of Jesus, they struggled with this contradictory image of what the Messiah was going to be like. At one moment, he's this conquering king who's able to take the whole world and allow little children to play with ass, allow the ox and the lion to lie down together, allow to change the universe. And then in another place, he's broken and beaten beyond recognition, taken upon himself the sins of the world, totally rejected, totally despised. Nobody wants him. And the people going, this can't be the same person. Can it? That question is going to be raised next week. Jesus did what he did in order to promote God's agenda. In fact, I really appreciate Jesus' laser focus, keeping first and foremost in his heart and in his mind what his mission was. And his mission was come to seek and to save the lost. And if Pastor Keith could keep that same focus, then he'd be more effective himself. But folks, I've confessed with you before, I really wrestle with point number 2. Because my biggest sin, what do they call that? Besetting sin that I wrestle with is trying to gain your approval. And that'll kill ministry if you're preaching only for people to say, oh, attaboy. A preacher, a pastor, an evangelist must be willing, first and foremost, to preach the truth. Because only the truth will set you free. And if the Son, who is the truth, sets you free, you are free indeed. You remember that guy in the 80s and 90s that had the real weird hair, rainbow hair, that had John 3:16 signs and was always in the primo spots at sporting events? World Series, he's right behind home plate. Super Bowl, he's right behind the goalposts where they're... I always wondered how filthy rich this guy had to be in order to be able to get those kind of seats. I mean, every major event, there he was, shaking his head, holding this big, huge sign with, had to be 400 font print. John 3:16. There's an interesting story about him. I always wondered about this guy. I mean, just, really? Do you know that he holed himself up in a hotel room and held the hotel and policemen hostage until he could get an interview on TV in order to make a religious statement? And the news carried this guy holding a pistol, holding the hotel and the policeman hostage, spewing out Bible verses, all the while threatening the lives of all those around him. Yeah, that's a way to promote the gospel. Folks, that's not the spirit Jesus wants us to have. I'll tell you the spirit what Jesus wants to have is the spirit of Pauline Port. I don't know if however many remember this or not, but George Bush, the second George Bush, President of the United States, had what he called Points of Light Award. Maybe it was first. It was first. I think it was first. Had Points of Light Awards. And he would try to find people in the United States who were doing extraordinary volunteer work for the broken reeds and the smoldering wick people of the world, and he would give them national recognition as a opportunity to encourage the rest of the United States, the citizens, to get on board, to not ask what the country can do for you, but ask what you can do for the country. Mixing two different presidents, I know. And so President Bush called up Pauline Port in Memphis, Tennessee, and said, Pauline, I really appreciate the work that you're doing there with the elderly, illiterate, and the people that are in prison that are illiterate. And you go into these prisons, you go into these nursing homes, you go into these senior centers, and you encourage them to read and encourage them to expand their understanding of the universe by spending time with them and teaching them how to read. And so I want to give you a Points of Light award. I'm going to be in Memphis this next Friday. Can I have lunch with you? She said, no. I'm booked this Friday to be in a prison in Mississippi to help the inmates there. Can we find another time? Do you hear what she said? She told the President of the United States, no, you can't see me because I need to spend time with some inmates in a prison. There's a woman who understands her focus and her purpose in life. That is so unlike the John 3:16 hair guy. Jesus is the Lord's servant, humbly doing God's work without self-promotion. 3, Jesus is the Lord's gentle servant doing God's work, encouraging the broken and discarded and building up the weak and insecure. That's what he says in verse 20. A bruised reed he won't break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out till he leads justice to victory. Jesus is willing to take the people who appear to be worthless, useless, and completely not worth our time investing in, and he says, no, nobody is that way. Now, this is where I'm really glad that I delegate these responsibilities to other people. There are people who are broken reeds and smoldering wicks who will suck the life out of you and suck the life out of the church if you're not discerning. Jesus, David, Paul, Peter, James, John, all the biblical writers understood that there are enemies of God and there are people who need to be led to God. And you need to be discerning on who those people are. And folks, we get people all the time that are wanting help, smoldering wicks and bruised reeds coming to this church wanting financial assistance. And I am eternally grateful that there are people in this congregation who make the decision of whether to help them or not is based upon their investigation of their lives to find out whether or not they really have a heart that is repentant, wanting to come to Christ, or whether or not they're just mean and this is God's judgment on them. Does that make sense? Because folks, there is a difference. And we don't want to be blessing the people that God is cursing. Okay, there's more than 3 people that are on board with this. That's always comforting. And folks, it's hard, and I don't have the time to be able to discern that, but there are people in this congregation who take the time to try to make that discernment in order to help the people that really need the help and not help the people that really are as a result of God's judgment upon them because of their lifestyle, because of their decisions. And that's tough. It takes the Spirit's discernment, which the text that we looked at says that Jesus enjoys. And you should enjoy if you're willing to submit to the Spirit. There's a really, really cool line in Seabiscuit, the story about the horse, that I really, every time I watch it, it does my heart good. It's not one of those messianic themes that comes through movies sometimes. The scene is this. Tom Smith, who is the trainer that is eventually going to be hired by Mr. Howard to train Seabiscuit, Tom Smith is out in the woods and he's around a campfire and he's got his little pot of coffee there, and Mr. Howard comes out to inquire about Tom Smith because he's been spending a lot of time with these down and out horses that should have been shot. I mean, they get a bruised ankle or something like that and a broken ankle, you should just shoot them and put them out of their misery. But Tom Smith has been investing a lot of time in this particular horse to rehabilitate him, and Mr. Howard says to Tom Smith, "Why are you doing this?" And Tom Smith says, "Because I can. I can make him better." And then he says this, "You don't throw a whole life away just because he's banged up a little." Wow, do we need to hear that? People are created in God's image. Every single person alive on the planet is much more complex and much more worthwhile and valuable than the greatest computer. But in our materialistic, carnal age we live in, we are shoving the useless people, the discarded people, the worthless people aside, and we're only exalting the great people, when the God of the universe has a tendency to just flip that on his head. It's a real challenge to our value systems to look at how the God of the universe wants to take the broken people and make them whole again. These are a couple of candlestick holders. They're very small. It's for a reason. I made these in 1971 in a shop in the basement of my house. To this day, I still wonder why my mother allowed me to have a wood shop in the basement of her house. We did have a Michigan basement, which explained a little bit of it. If you're familiar with the Michigan basement, it's a dirt floor. These are made entirely out of scraps. I could not, in 1971, afford real walnut and real maple, so I got these from projects that other people did that they discarded, were going to burn. And I said, can I have those? And they said, yeah. Okay, you're not impressed. So but folks, I have in my house now, what used to be in my mom's house before my parents passed away, I now inherited them back, a lot of those kind of things that I was able to make out of what people were willing to throw away. It takes a little more time. It's not nearly as easy. You have to be a little more creative. But I really believe it reflects the heart of God. Are you willing to do that with the discarded people of this world? The God of the universe says we better be willing to do that. Number 4, Jesus is the Lord's servant doing God's work, bringing salvation to the whole world. This one may not appear to you to be as heart-wrenching, but to me it is. In his name, the nations will put their hope. In order for us to be like Jesus, a Lord's servant, willing to do what is necessary in order to promote the kingdom of God, in order to promote the broken and smoldering people of the world, to allow them to be restored, we need to be faithful in our efforts and not be a servant just when it's convenient. I wonder about the 21st century American church, because I really think we're a bunch of wusses. Some of you know, if you've been here, going here a number of years, that I am very reluctant to cancel church, because that's a 1 day out of 7. It's less than 1/80th of your time in a week. But there's only 1 2-hour period of time out of 7 days that we have a chance to reflect and worship the God of the universe. So when there's 2 inches of snow, I'm not going to cancel unless it's 40 feet somewhere else. Well, that might be a little much. And can I be quite frank with you all? Oh boy. Don't encourage me. I really get upset at the number of churches that cancel church with 2 inches of snow and it's not blowing. Because why? I'll know they'll make a trip to Walmart to get a gallon of milk. What have we just said? My trip to Walmart and getting a gallon of milk is more valuable to me than coming and worshiping the God of the universe. That's pathetic. And we wonder why the world looks at us and doesn't take notice of us. We're not worth taking notice of. I get the feeling that some churches like to cancel and will cancel the slightest opportunity they get in order to not have to do it. And I know this is not going to make some of you happy, but it's along the same lines. And I can't believe some of you are as honest and as frank in your conversation with me as you are. But you'll tell me about the number of doctor's appointments that you make during the week. You'll tell me about the number of concerts that you went to. You'll tell me about the number of games that you went to with your grandchildren. You'll tell me about the number of trips to the store you had to make. But then you'll tell me you can't make it on Sunday morning because you're too busy and too tired. Where is your salvation? Where is your hope? What are you telling the rest of the world is your salvation and your hope? By the choices that you make. There's a quote that I'd like to read. It's in your sermon outline. It's the first one under point number 4. And you're all saying, "Whew, oh, good. The pressure here was just too much. I'm glad Pastor Keith got us off this topic." Look what this has to say if you think you're off the hook. I'm just getting started. Self-righteous service picks and chooses whom to serve. Sometimes the high and powerful are served because that will ensure a certain advantage. Sometimes the low and defenseless are served because that will ensure a humble image. True service is indiscriminate in its ministry. It has heard the command of Jesus to be the servant of all. Brother Francis of Assisi notes in a letter, "Being a servant of all, I am bound to serve all and to minister the balm-bearing words of my Lord." Self-righteous service is affected by moods and whims. It can serve only when there is a feeling to serve, moved by the Spirit, we say. Oh, man. Ill health or inadequate sleep controls the desire to serve. True service ministers simply and faithfully. True service ministers simply and faithfully because there is a need. It knows that the feeling to serve can often be a hindrance to true service. The service disciplines the feelings rather than allowing the feeling to control the service. Do you hear what that's saying? If we're like Jesus, it doesn't matter how we feel. We see a need and know we should fill it because we can, and so we do. Whether or not we've slept good or not, whether we've just ate or not, whether we got other things we'd like to do or not. And we wonder why the world doesn't give attention to us when we make the things of the church 4th and 5th and 6th priority. Jesus is the Lord's servant doing God's work, bringing salvation to the whole world. I know this. I am eternally grateful that the Lord Jesus, in the face of what he had to endure on the cross, did not say, "Well, I don't feel like it. I'm off the hook." Worship point is this. The reason why our worship is pathetic in the West is because we are clueless as to what the world would be like without Jesus' influence. And folks, we are living on borrowed capital off of our forefathers. A lot of the judicial system here in the States, a lot of the economic system, a lot of the moral systems that we take for granted are part of what our forefathers have established for us, and we just take them for granted and they're just built into our psyche. But folks, they are eroding, and they are slipping out of our fingers and becoming less and less a part of the moral fabric, the cultural fabric of this nation. And as they continue to go, our quality of living here in the States is going to continue to diminish. And if you don't understand that concept, I double dog dare you to spend a week to 10 days in a third world nation, and you'll get a real fast dose of what it means to live in a world that doesn't understand these principles. And you'll be glad to come back and kiss the ground of the United States, where we are one nation under God. At least we used to be. Well, more than now. We just don't understand how much the Lord does for us. We don't understand how much it's built into the very fabric of this nation. There's a couple that really illustrates this, I think, fairly well. There was a couple, he was mayor of the town and she was his wife, and they were going to the mayoral ball of this particular city. And they were stopping at a gas station, and the attendant at the gas station used to be a boyfriend of the wife of the mayor now. And so the gas station was pumping the gas, and if you're in Oregon, then you understand all this. You can't pump your own gas in Oregon. That's true still, right? Okay, yeah, okay. And so while the guy is pumping the gas, he used to be the former boyfriend of the mayor's wife, right? And so the husband looks over to the wife and says, aren't you glad you married me rather than Harry there pumping the gas? He's still pumping gas, and I'm mayor. And the wife leans over and says, honey, if I would have married Harry, you'd be pumping gas and he'd be mayor. Do you understand that you are who you are by God's grace? 1 Corinthians 15:10. Do you understand that every good and perfect gift does not come as a result of your merits, your deserving, but every good and perfect gift comes as a result of the Father of life, the Father of lights, bestowing that gift to us? The more you keep that in mind, the more you understand with humility that you are who you are by God's grace, the more close you're going to be to the heart of God to be able to not only enjoy those benefits for a longer period of time, but also to be a light and life to other people, helping people that are broken and bruised reeds, helping people who are smoldering wicks. But the minute you think you got where you are because you deserve it, you've lost your mind. Because what you deserve is hell. Something beautiful, something good. All my confusion he understood. All I had to offer him was brokenness and strife. But he made something beautiful of my life. Gospel application is this: Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, but he washed it white as snow. A corresponding suffering servant text that goes along with Isaiah 42. There are about 5 or 6 of them in the book of Isaiah. But one that's closely associated with the text that we read from Isaiah 42 is Isaiah 53. I want to read that to you. A lot of you will be immediately familiar with this text. But folks, if you're not familiar with this text, it should be an illustrative indicator to you of the extent to which Jesus was willing to suffer in order to redeem and bring salvation and healing and justice to our lives. This is what Isaiah says in Isaiah 53, verse 2. He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing is an appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was placed upon him. And by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and yet as a sheep before her shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him. It was the Lord's will to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. That's the extent Jesus was willing to go in order to bring us salvation and justice and life in our world. Look to Jesus. Get to know Jesus. Be a servant like Jesus. Change the world like Jesus. There's a great story And folks, this lesson is not just about Jesus and how we need to become servants to the broken people. This lesson is about Jesus and how you need to be a servant to your roommate. You need to be a servant to your wife. You need to be a servant to your husband. You need to be a servant to your children. You need to be a servant to your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your mother. That neighbor. Oh, Pastor Keith, not my neighbor. There's a great story that comes out of Moody Bible Institute. This is probably 30, 40 years ago. If you're familiar with Moody Bible Institute, they have a radio broadcast that basically goes around the world, millions and millions of listeners. And at this particular time, Robert Little was the main expositor and teacher on the Moody Broadcast Network. And he was very, very popular. In fact, people from all over the world would call Robert Little and ask him questions about the Bible and ask just pastoral advice, because he was a pastor to a lot of people that would listen on the radio. He got a call one day from a man in Chicago that was obviously a little backwards. You could tell by his broken English, you could tell by his slow speech, you could just tell that he was not one of the most up-and-coming and movers and shakers in the city of Chicago. And so this man called up Robert Little at the Moody Bible Institute and said, is Robert Little there? And Robert Little said, yeah, this is me. And he said, can you come and bury my dog? Robert Little said, say what? Well, Mr. Little, my dog was my only friend. And I want to give him a Christian burial. And you're the only pastor I know. Will you come and bury my dog? He did. Because Robert Little has the heart of a servant. And understood that this man had lost the only friend that he knew. What makes this story so hard is because I know there's been a lot of broken reeds and smoldering wicks in my life that I've thrown in the trash and not given the time of day. And if you're halfway aware at all of anyone else around you, you're in the same position. Now, I'm not saying you're the next Messiah and you're going to save them all. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that we need to be alert and aware of the broken reeds and the smoldering wicks in our lives, and that we don't discard them because they are men and women, sons and daughters created in God's image. And there's one coming in your life that you need to work to redeem. Even though they may make your eyes water and may make your life very, very much want to gag. That is what Jesus did for us. And if we really understand Jesus' sacrifice for us, if we really have a comprehension of how much he was willing to suffer on our behalf, we'll be willing to do that for others. I still love this quote from Jesus' Nazareth video. It's the last one in your sermon outline. The Son of Man has come into the world to take upon himself the sins of the world. If you want to follow him, you must be willing to do the same.